The aircraft was cruising smoothly above the clouds when suddenly the cabin lights flickered and a sharp vibration rippled through the fuselage, causing anxious whispers to spread among passengers as the captain's tense voice echoed over the intercom announcing an unexpected technical issue and requesting everyone to remain seated and calm while the crew assessed the situation. And in that very moment the atmosphere inside the cabin shifted from one of routine comfort to an uneasy silence broken only by the low hum of the engines and the distant cry of a frightened child who sensed the change before anyone else dared to openly acknowledge it, while outside the thick blanket of clouds rolled endlessly beneath the wings, giving the illusion of peace that cruelly contrasted with the growing tension within, as passengers exchanged worried glances, some clutching their armrests tightly, others whispering prayers under their breath, and a few attempting nervous smiles to reassure their companions. Yet the unease could not be hidden as another jolt coursed through the aircraft, stronger than before, forcing overhead luggage compartments to rattle and a few loose items to tumble onto the floor, prompting flight attendants to move swiftly down the aisles with practiced urgency, their faces composed but eyes revealing the seriousness of the situation as they reminded everyone to fasten their seatbelts and remain seated, while the captain's voice returned, calmer yet edged with unmistakable concern, explaining that the aircraft had encountered a mechanical irregularity and that standard procedures were being followed to ensure passenger safety, words that were meant to soothe but only deepened the sense of dread as the realization set in that this was no ordinary turbulence but a genuine mid-flight emergency, and as minutes stretched into what felt like hours the plane began an uneven descent, the angle shifting just enough for passengers to notice, their stomachs tightening as gravity subtly pressed them into their seats, and with every passing second their imagination painted terrifying scenarios of what could go wrong, from engine failure to complete loss of control, as the faint smell of something unfamiliar drifted through the air, metallic and sharp, further alarming those who recognized it as possibly burnt wiring or stressed machinery, and despite the controlled demeanor of the crew, fear blossomed quietly in every corner of the cabin, creeping into the hearts of even the most composed individuals, as a middle-aged man silently tightened his grip on his wife's hand, a young traveler stared blankly out the window trying to find comfort in the endless sky, and an elderly passenger counted her breaths as though each one might be her last, while the intercom crackled again and the captain informed everyone that an emergency landing would be attempted at the nearest airport, a statement that brought both a fragile sense of hope and an intensified wave of anxiety, as the reality of an imminent landing under dangerous conditions finally sank in and every passenger became hyper-aware of every vibration, every unusual sound, every slight change in pressure, as oxygen masks suddenly dropped from the ceiling panels in a soft cascade, swinging gently in front of wide eyes that quickly filled with panic, while the attendants demonstrated how to use them with steady precision, guiding trembling hands and offering quick words of reassurance that echoed hollowly in the tense air, and as the plane continued its descent the once steady roar of the engines shifted into a strained, uneven thrum that vibrated through the seats and into the bones of everyone aboard, as the sky outside darkened slightly and the outlines of distant terrain began to emerge through breaks in the cloud cover, marking the approach to land and reminding everyone just how vulnerable they were in that metal vessel suspended between heaven and earth, with no control over their fate except the trust placed in the skill of the pilots and the resilience of the aircraft. And as the runway finally came into view far below, its lights like a thin glowing line in the distance, the pilot issued final instructions, urging calm, proper seating position, and readiness for impact, his voice firm and commanding, yet betraying the gravity of the situation through the faintest quiver that no one failed to notice, as passengers bowed their heads, closed their eyes, or stared ahead in silent resolve, each lost in their own thoughts, memories, and regrets, wishing they had said more, loved more, lived more, while the plane angled downward, descending faster now, fighting against strong winds that buffeted the wings with relentless force, causing the fuselage to shudder violently as if protesting against the unnatural strain, and in those final moments every second felt magnified, every heartbeat loud enough to drown out the alarms that wailed intermittently in the background, as the ground rushed closer and the tension reached an unbearable peak, until the aircraft finally made contact with the runway in a brutal, jarring impact, the screech of tires tearing against asphalt piercing the air as sparks flew beneath the windows and the entire frame shook with ferocious intensity, tossing passengers forward against their tightened seatbelts, eliciting gasps, cries, and stifled screams, as the plane struggled to slow its momentum, swerving slightly before straightening under the steady control of the cockpit, the brakes applied with full force while emergency sirens blared outside and fire trucks raced alongside the runway, their flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the walls of the trembling cabin, as the aircraft jolted forward one final time before grinding to an exhausted halt, leaving behind a profound, almost sacred silence that swept over the passengers, a silence filled with shock, disbelief, and overwhelming relief, broken only by the quiet sobs of those who had truly believed they would not survive, as the captain's voice emerged once more, now softened by gratitude and exhaustion, informing everyone that they had landed safely and instructing them to remain seated as emergency crews assessed the situation outside, and in those words a collective exhale swept through the cabin, a release of fear so intense it left many weak and trembling, as strangers exchanged grateful looks, some holding hands, others offering whispered thanks, tears streaming freely down faces that only moments before had been pale with terror, as flight attendants moved once again through the aisle, now with gentler smiles and words of comfort, ensuring that everyone was unharmed, while outside the glow of the runway lights illuminated the heroic efforts of firefighters and rescue teams standing ready in case of further complications, and though the ordeal had left invisible scars of fear and shock in the minds of all aboard, it had also forged an unspoken bond among them, a shared experience of survival in the fragile beauty of life, as eventually the doors were opened and fresh air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of safety and ground beneath them, and one by one passengers stepped off the aircraft onto solid earth, their legs shaky but hearts filled with gratitude, realizing that what had begun as an ordinary journey through the sky had transformed into a harrowing story of courage, resilience, and the unwavering human will to endure, a story that would be remembered not just as a terrifying emergency, but as a powerful reminder of how quickly life can change and how precious every breath truly is. Minutes later the engines began emitting an unfamiliar roar and the plane started to descend faster than normal, oxygen masks dangling overhead as flight attendants hurried through the aisle reassuring terrified faces while the pilot informed the control tower of a mid-flight emergency and prepared for a high-risk landing on the nearest available runway, and within seconds the once orderly cabin transformed into a landscape of raw human emotion where fear, disbelief, and desperate hope merged into one suffocating atmosphere, as the strange mechanical howl grew louder and more strained, vibrating through the floor, the seats, and even the rib cages of those trapped inside, making every breath feel heavier and every heartbeat painfully sharp, while passengers fumbled clumsily with the falling masks, their hands shaking as they tried to remember the safety instructions that had seemed so routine and insignificant just a short while ago, and children clung to their parents, eyes wide and brimming with tears, sensing the danger even without fully understanding it, as the attendants moved with disciplined urgency, their voices steady yet laced with a subtle tremor as they guided people to secure the masks over their noses and mouths, demonstrating again and again with precise gestures, leaning down to adjust straps for the elderly, murmuring words of comfort to those who had begun to sob uncontrollably, and offering firm encouragement to those frozen in panic, while the captain's calm but taut voice echoed over the intercom, explaining that a system failure had compromised normal operations and that the aircraft would be descending rapidly to attempt an emergency landing, urging everyone to follow the crew's instructions carefully, yet despite his attempt to project control, the seriousness of the situation seeped into every syllable, and the realization that their lives now depended on a battle between human skill and mechanical uncertainty weighed heavily on every soul on board, as the plane tilted slightly, the unnatural angle making stomachs twist and heads press back against headrests under the increased force of gravity, while loose items slid across trays and urgent warning chimes pierced the air like sharp needles of sound, and the outside world, once distant and peaceful, now came rushing closer through small oval windows offering fleeting glimpses of darkened clouds and faint outlines of land below, as if the earth itself was rising to meet them in a hurried, unforgiving embrace, and amid the chaos some passengers clutched their personal belongings as if tangible memories could anchor them to life, while others whispered prayers, recited final thoughts, or simply closed their eyes and surrendered to whatever fate awaited them, their minds racing through fragments of past joys and unfinished dreams, as a young man stared blankly ahead recalling the warmth of his mother's voice, a businesswoman pressed her forehead against the cool plastic of the seat believing she might never see her children again, and an older gentleman traced trembling fingers over a worn photograph tucked inside his wallet, each individual locked in an intimate moment of silent reckoning, bonded by a shared fear yet tragically alone in their thoughts, while the aircraft continued its descent with jarring instability, the roar of the engines now uneven and desperate, punctuated by sudden shudders that rippled through the entire structure, each one sending fresh waves of panic through the cabin as overhead compartments rattled and the scent of overheated metal mingled with the sharp chemical tang of recycled oxygen, creating a claustrophobic haze that made the air feel thick and oppressive, yet through it all the crew moved tirelessly, checking seatbelts, ensuring proper brace positions, repeating instructions in measured tones that fought against the rising storm of hysteria, as the pilot communicated continuously with the control tower, his voice threading through the static as he reported fluctuating pressure levels, compromised hydraulics, and the delicate balance required to keep the aircraft aligned, while on the ground emergency services mobilized in anticipation, their unseen presence forming the only thin line of hope between survival and catastrophe. As time stretched into an agonizing blur where seconds felt like minutes and each passing moment heightened the dreadful anticipation of impact, and the plane, now descending through turbulent layers of wind, shook violently as though struggling against an invisible force determined to pull it apart, the wings flexing under immense strain while the fuselage groaned in protest, and yet still it pushed forward, guided by the steadfast hands on the controls and the unyielding will to save every life on board, as passengers braced themselves, gripping armrests so tightly their knuckles turned white, their bodies involuntarily tensing with every lurch and dip, eyes darting toward the tiny windows in search of reassurance only to find the blurred rush of ground below growing closer, clearer, more menacing, and when the runway lights finally shimmered into view, appearing like a narrow glowing thread in the darkness, a faint murmur of fragile relief rippled through the cabin even as fear deepened, for the sight of land meant both salvation and the inescapable truth that the most dangerous moment still lay ahead, and as the plane aligned for the final approach, the pilot's voice returned one last time to instruct everyone to assume the brace position, his tone unwavering but heavy with gravity, and obediently passengers bent forward, arms over heads, foreheads pressed to the backs of seats, eyes shut tight as if retreating from a reality too terrifying to confront, while the engines thundered with a desperate intensity, fighting against gravity, wind, and failing systems in one final attempt to achieve a controlled landing, and as the aircraft descended the last few hundred feet, the tension grew so thick it seemed almost tangible, every soul suspended between hope and despair, every breath shallow and fragile, until the first brutal contact with the ground shattered the silence in an explosion of sound, the wheels slamming against the runway with bone-rattling force as the plane skidded forward, its metal frame shrieking in protest, sparks flying in brilliant streaks against the dark, and the cabin erupting in cries, prayers, and muffled screams as bodies lurched violently against tightened belts, the violent shaking making it feel as though the aircraft might tear itself apart at any second, yet still it pressed onward, guided, braked, and steadied through sheer determination and expert control, as emergency vehicles raced alongside, their flashing lights casting frantic patterns across the cabin walls, and finally, after what felt like an eternity balanced on the knife edge of disaster, the aircraft slowed, shuddered, and came to a complete stop, leaving behind an echoing silence so profound it almost hurt to hear, followed by the broken sobs of relief, shaky laughter, and whispered expressions of gratitude as the realization spread that they had survived, that the nightmare was over, and that life had been granted to them once more, and as smoke faintly curled outside and the smell of scorched rubber lingered in the air, the captain spoke again, his voice softened by exhaustion and quiet triumph, reassuring everyone that emergency teams were securing the aircraft and evacuation would begin shortly, and in those precious moments of stillness before the doors finally opened, passengers looked around at one another with new eyes, no longer strangers but companions bound by shared terror and shared survival, understanding in that profound silence just how powerful the human spirit could be when faced with the edge of mortality, and how a simple journey through the sky had transformed into an unforgettable testament to courage, resilience, and the fragile miracle of being alive. As the runway lights appeared in the distance, the aircraft struggled against strong crosswinds, its wheels hovering just feet above the ground before violently touching down, screeching across the tarmac as sparks flew and the entire cabin braced for impact, hearts pounding in fear and hope. And in that terrifying instant the world seemed to slow as if every second was stretching itself to its breaking point, the roar of the engines blending with the shrill cry of overstressed metal and the tremor of the fuselage vibrating through every seat and every bone, making it impossible to tell whether the plane was fighting to stay intact or surrendering to the chaos of the moment, while passengers clung to whatever they could reach, armrests, seatbacks, the hands of loved ones, their eyes wide with a mixture of horror and desperate belief that somehow they would make it through. And as the wheels made their first brutal contact with the ground, the force of the impact rippled from the undercarriage through the entire structure, slamming bodies forward against tightened seatbelts and forcing gasps and cries from trembling lips as the plane bucked and lurched like a wounded beast trying to regain control, its massive weight skidding across the runway while the pilot wrestled with the controls, fighting the furious crosswinds that lashed against the wings and threatened to push the aircraft off course. And outside the windows the world flashed by in a blur of lights and shadows as sparks streaked beneath the cabin, illuminating the night in brief, violent bursts, each flare a stark reminder of how close they were to disaster, and inside the cabin panic teetered on the edge of breaking into full chaos, yet the piercing voice of a flight attendant rose above the noise, urging everyone to remain in the brace position, to stay down, to stay calm, words that echoed through the air like a fragile lifeline, even as the aircraft skidded sideways for a heart-stopping moment, the angle unnatural and terrifying, causing a fresh surge of fear to tear through every soul on board. as some passengers cried openly, others prayed aloud, and a few simply squeezed their eyes shut as if denying the sight would somehow soften the reality, and the screech of rubber against asphalt grew louder as the brakes strained under enormous pressure, the plane shuddering violently with each desperate attempt to slow its momentum, the nose dipping and rising with each uneven surge while the wings trembled under the invisible grip of the wind, and with every jolt there was the haunting fear that the aircraft might tip, or veer, or break apart entirely, yet still it thundered forward, stubbornly clinging to the runway as the pilot fought to keep it aligned, his training and instinct guiding every movement in a battle measured in inches and seconds, as emergency vehicles raced alongside, their sirens wailing through the night and their flashing lights casting frantic colors across the interior of the cabin, reflections dancing over terrified faces and wide eyes that tracked every violent motion of the plane, and in those long, unbearable moments time lost all meaning, replaced only by the raw awareness of survival hanging by the thinnest thread, as the passengers felt every vibration, every grinding shudder, every sharp pull and sway as though the aircraft itself was protesting against the strain of its own descent, and with a final thunderous jolt the plane began to slow, its speed dropping inch by inch until the fierce scream of the tires softened into a heavy, rattling rumble, and slowly, painfully, the aircraft steadied, still trembling but no longer spiraling out of control, and when it finally came to a complete stop an almost unreal silence flooded the cabin, broken only by ragged breaths, quiet sobs, and the soft rustle of shaking bodies trying to comprehend what had just happened, as the realization spread that they were still alive, that the ground beneath them was solid and real, and that the worst had passed, leaving behind a fragile wave of relief so powerful it brought tears even to those who had tried so hard to remain composed, as strangers looked at one another with shared disbelief and gratitude, their expressions softening from terror to stunned relief, and the voice of the captain, exhausted yet steady, emerged over the intercom confirming that the aircraft had landed and instructing everyone to remain seated until further notice, his words met with a collective exhale that swept through the cabin like the release of a storm, and in that moment every passenger understood just how close they had come to losing everything, how precious each heartbeat truly was, and how a simple flight through the sky had transformed into a vivid reminder of life's fragility and the extraordinary courage that had carried them safely back to the earth. Finally the plane came to a shaking halt surrounded by emergency vehicles and flashing lights, a wave of stunned silence followed by emotional relief as passengers realized they had survived the terrifying ordeal, turning a moment of fear into an unforgettable story of courage and precision. And in those first fragile seconds after the brutal motion ceased there was an eerie stillness that felt almost sacred, as if the entire world had paused to acknowledge the narrow line they had just walked between life and death, while the hum of the engine slowly faded into a tired whisper and the tremors that had rattled bones and souls alike softened into a gentle quiver, leaving behind a cabin filled with wide eyes, trembling hands, and hearts still racing from the storm they had endured. And as smoke lingered faintly outside the windows and the reflection of pulsing red and blue lights danced across the interior walls, the harsh reality began to settle in that the nightmare had truly ended, that the ground beneath them was firm and real, and that breath, once shallow and fearful, now came in long, grateful waves, as scattered sobs broke the silence and were quickly joined by shaky laughter and whispered prayers of thanks, some speaking to God, some speaking to no one at all, just letting the emotions spill out in an uncontrolled release that felt both overwhelming and oddly cleansing, as a young mother pulled her child close and kissed his forehead repeatedly with tears streaming down her face. A businessman who had been rigid with tension moments earlier now bowed his head in quiet reflection, and a flight attendant leaned against a seat for just a second longer than professional decorum would normally allow, her own eyes shining with relief as she realized that every passenger under her care had made it through, and as the captain's voice finally returned over the intercom, softer now, laced with exhaustion and gratitude, informing the cabin that emergency services were securing the aircraft and evacuation would proceed carefully, his words were met with a collective murmur of appreciation, a sound that carried the weight of countless emotions, as strangers exchanged nods of silent understanding, hands reached out to comfort one another, and shared glances spoke volumes about the bond forged in the face of shared terror, a bond that no ordinary flight could ever create, as the plane remained still on the runway, surrounded by flashing beacons and vigilant rescue crews ready to respond at the slightest sign of danger, and every minute that passed without further incident strengthened the realization of survival, turning shock into gratitude and fear into quiet awe, as passengers slowly became aware of the smallest details they had once taken for granted, the softness of the seat fabric, the steady rhythm of their own breathing, the familiar faces around them, the simple miracle of being alive, and when the main doors finally opened and cool night air swept into the cabin, carrying with it the scent of fuel and damp earth, it felt like the first breath of freedom after being trapped beneath a crushing weight, and one by one passengers rose from their seats, legs unsteady but determined, gathering belongings that now felt insignificant compared to the sheer value of their lives, and as they stepped onto the emergency stairs the sight below of uniformed responders, ambulances, and blazing lights offered a powerful contrast to the darkness they had just escaped, a scene that felt almost surreal in its clarity and order after the chaos above, and some passengers paused briefly at the doorway, looking back at the aircraft that had both endangered and saved them, their expressions a mix of fear, gratitude, and disbelief, as if trying to comprehend how something so ordinary could transform into an arena of such intense emotion, and as feet touched solid ground a new wave of emotion rose within them, gratitude so deep it brought fresh tears, relief so strong it left some speechless, as they embraced family members who had rushed to the airport, called loved ones with trembling voices, or simply stood in silence, absorbing the profound meaning of what they had endured, while the crew, still maintaining their professionalism, guided everyone with care and patience, offering reassurance and small words of comfort even as they themselves processed the trauma of the event, and as the flashing lights continued to illuminate the night and the echo of sirens faded into the distance, the reality of survival transformed from a desperate hope into a quiet certainty, and in those moments every passenger carried with them a story that would never fully fade, a story etched into their memories by fear, resilience, and the unbreakable will of those who guided the plane safely to the ground, a story they would recount for years to come, not just as a tale of danger, but as a powerful reminder of how fragile life truly is and how extraordinary the human spirit can be when challenged by the unknown. And even as the airport resumed its normal rhythm and the world moved on, those who had been aboard that flight knew that something within them had changed forever, that ordinary moments would now carry deeper meaning, that every sunrise would feel slightly more precious, and that the simple act of stepping forward on solid earth would forever echo with the memory of that night when fear had turned into survival and precision had triumphed over chaos.